Okay, welcome everyone to today's Sihasin Hour. You guys know me, Ethel Branshinsha, Bipatwani Nishlin, Nakai Bashish Chains, and Ajani Dasha Chade, and Nakai Dashanoa. Sezizi Denasha, Kinthana Kehashche. And again, speaking to you from Flagstaff, which is one of the four sacred mountains, or has one of the four sacred mountains for the Navajo people. And is also sacred to 16 other Indigenous nations in Arizona. So very excited to be here with you, speaking here at the base of Dokot Sleeve. And we have some really very special guests here with us today. We have Nick Tilson from Indian Collective and Kevin Washburn currently from the University of Iowa. And I'll turn things over to them to introduce themselves briefly. Nick, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, sure. Hamadakyapi, Nick Tilson, Amachapi, Chuntaya Washtenape Chuzapalo. My name is Nick Tilson. I'm Oglala Lakota, President and CEO of the Indian Collective, and I'm calling in from Paisley, or Porcupine, here in my home community on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. And excited to have this conversation about LandBack and co-management and strengthening sovereignty.
And I'm Kevin Washburn, and I'm taking it on trust that my Navajo is a little bit rusty and my Lakota is a little rusty too. And so I'm just taking it on trust that they didn't say, we're here with this dummy. So I'm Kevin Washburn. I'm the Dean of the University of Iowa College of Law. I'm a member of the Sihasin Nation of Oklahoma, and a sometime government official, and I've been a professor at several places around Indian country. And I'm excited also to be here with you today and with Nick and Ethel. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're so pleased to have you both here with us. And this particular moment that we're in history, it just feels like this is the right conversation to be having. The UN's Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services 2019 report found that the rapid global mass extinction is actually slower on lands managed by Indigenous communities. And Indigenous communities are identified as being better on average at managing the hazards of pollution and species decline. This has been confirmed with studies from various landscapes across Canada, Brazil, Australia, and Namibia. And so, there's this huge imperative to increase the level of management of land by Indigenous peoples who are from those lands and have centuries of knowledge on how to interact with the land in an appropriate and constructive way to preserve life, whether that's human life, animal life, and maintain balance in these spaces. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. And we'll go ahead and get things started with Nick. I wish I had the technological capabilities to run that little piece in Reservation Dogs. There's this great introduction where this elderly couple in Oklahoma is riding along, and when the woman says, well, "What do you think they mean by land back? Do you think they really mean all of the land back?" It was just such a great moment in that introduction to that episode. And so Nick, can you share with our viewers what land back means?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, land back means a lot of things, but I think the thing that I really resonate with about it is it speaks direct. It's a narrative and a movement that has come directly from Indian people and Indigenous people from our lived experience. So I always say, anytime you want to understand what land back is, ask an Indigenous person, land back, what does that mean to you? And at first they'll be like, yeah, land back, right? There's a thing that happens there. And it's a narrative that works with our people, because it wasn't just, it's not just the return of physical land back, physical lands back to our people. When the land was taken our entire economy was affected. Our lifeways were affected. Our ceremonies were affected. Our languages were affected. Our societal structures and decision-making structures, our education systems, our political systems. And a lot of times there's like this disconnect, right, in mainstream society from, oh, wow, what's going on with these Indians? Like still, what's going on with the problem there? And I think that a lot of times we have to find narratives that weave together folks that are, from the res all the way to the White House, and I think that LandBack is one of these narratives that provides a thread. And I think that some of, like, if you look at social justice movements around the world, often it is the artist, the activists, the culture bearers, the storytellers, that are the interpreters of our culture. And a lot of times that some of the strongest narratives throughout human history have often come from artists, culture bearers. That's where LandBack came from. LandBack came from Indigenous artists and activists on the front lines in, so-called Canada, who were fighting for land rights and sovereignty and self-determination up there. And then, and then you started seeing sort of LandBack art come out, and people were like, yeah, LandBack art, and then you started seeing Indigimemers, right, in Canada, who were like Indigenous memers who were using, memes as a mechanism to promote Indigenous rights in LandBack. And then that movement just started taking off, right? And then I think that, for us, it really, it hit home with so much of the work that we're doing here at the Indian Collective, because we're like, if we can return land back to Indian people, it means that we would have to have restructured many of the relationships that Indian people have with the federal government and with the colonial governments that govern our people and impact the everyday lives of our people. So LandBack is like a war cry for the liberation of Indigenous people and our lands. And it means that we must take action, similar to the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, right? Black Lives Matter, therefore, ... things need to change. Therefore, the Breathe Act. Therefore, the implementation of new policies. Therefore, strategies to defund the police and increase funding for education. I think LandBack is similar to that. LandBack, therefore, let's move to a policy era of free and prior informed consent, instead of this era of consultation that hasn't bared fruit to our people. Let's reestablish the relationship between the federal government and Native people. Let's return land so that we can rebuild our economies and rebuild our homes and protect Mother Earth. And so I think that LandBack means so many different things, but I love it now because now, it is becoming something that is shortening the distance between the folks on the front line and those making policy in society today. And so, and I think that we're at a reckoning. I mean, I think that clearly, at the stage that this country is at, it's a reckoning with its past a little bit. And I think that LandBack provides a challenge. It holds a mirror up to American society and says this country was built on Indigenous people's land, but it also creates a path forward. It's not just shame on you, American government. It's, this is what's happened, and here's a path forward. LandBack, therefore co-management. LandBack, therefore the protection of sacred places. LandBack, therefore non-extractive industries, through our territories. And so I think that there's a lot of things that LandBack means, but that's the thing at the end of the day I love. It's like, it is a war cry. It's a call to action. It is, something that wakes up folks that can protest in the front lines, all the way to folks that are trying to, create policy for the future of Indian people. And it closes the gap between those places.
Ethel, can I jump in there for just a minute? So I was at the White House the other day for the White House Tribal Nations Summit, and Gina McCarthy was there, and she was carrying this book. And I said, what's that book? Because it was dog-eared and it had sticky notes sticking out of it. And she held it up, and it was called Required Reading. I can't remember what the subtitle was, but it was Nick, the book that Nick and his team have put out. And she'd been reading it. I mean, the neat thing is, I mean, it looked dog-eared. It looked like she'd been through it 17 times. And it was really, it was apparent to me that Nick is changing the narrative in this area. In college, I had this bumper sticker and it said Indian country, and it was white bumper sticker with green letters. Maybe you've seen it, green block letters. It said Indian country, and it had the entire Western hemisphere. It had North America and South America was the picture. And that, in other words, it's all Indian country. All the Western hemisphere is Indian country, probably all the rest of it as well, but certainly the Western hemisphere. And it's funny because in the Obama administration, we worked really hard on restoring land into trust for tribes. And I think we ultimately, in total, restored about 560,000 acres of land into trust, and then about 2 million acres in fractional interests through the Cobell settlement and the land buyback program. But the conversation has become so much broader since then and so much bigger. It's just a deeper conversation that's being had, and a much more interesting one. The piece that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, I put out because David Troyer had proposed in the Atlantic Monthly, how about we give all the national parks lands back to where, the tribes. And that really, that's a big idea. That's a very big idea. And so it's really neat to see how big the ideas have become since the Obama administration. Kudos to the people that are causing that conversation to happen.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, a third of land in this country is federal public lands, right? So there's a lot of land that is so-called unpeopled, that is, is kind of low-hanging fruit. How do tribes re-exert authority over those lands so as to make those lands more hospitable to continuation of life and preservation of ecosystems and whatnot. So, well, thank you so much for that background, Nick. That's very helpful. And we'll go ahead and just keep this flowing as a conversation then, and pass things over to Dean Washburn, Kevin, if I can call you Kevin. It always, as your former student, it always feels.
Ethel was my research assistant one year when I was teaching at Harvard Law School, visiting there for a year. So we go way back when Ethel was just a baby, a law student, and then became Attorney General of the Navajo Nation, everything else. So proud. Yeah, so the idea that I had was, there's been a lot of talk about tribal co-management of federal public lands, and there's been a lot of talk and not a lot of action, honestly. And so, and one of the things is people don't know how to do it. How do we do it? How do we create it? And so my piece is a fairly modest piece, but we do know how to contract. The federal government does know how to contract with tribal governments. We know how to make contracts with one another. And we do it in the Bureau of Indian Affairs context, the BIA, and in the Indian Health Service, the IHS context. And what tribes do, and this happens with, frankly, there used to be a Bureau of Indian Affairs on any, an agency on every reservation in essence, and then every tribe, where the BIA largely ran tribal governments. I mean, ran governments on the reservations. And in the 1970s, tribes started taking that over. Tribes, Congress passed laws, the Indian Self-Determination Act, that allowed tribes to take over doing that work and use the money that the BIA was using before. So, and services started to improve to Indian people whenever that happened. It's, tribal people serve tribal people better than federal employees tend to serve Indian people. And so we saw vast improvements in the work of the BIA and the work of the IHS when it was done by tribes rather than those agencies. And it was a long slog. It was a tough process, but eventually the BIA and the IHS started to embrace it to some degree. And now more than half the budget of the BIA and more than half the budget of the Indian Health Service is actually spent by tribes providing services to Indian people. Well, in the 1990s, that program, that it was called the 638 contracting program, that was expanded in some ways to allow federal public land agencies like the Bureau of Land Management and the National Park Service and the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was expanded to allow them also to contract with tribes if they wish to do so that they could contract and tribes could help run these, we call them facilities, but park units and that sort of thing. And it was a great idea, and it happened in the mid 1990s. But that's the law was changed to allow it, but it really hasn't been taken up. It really hasn't happened very often. There's a few instances in Indian country. There's a handful of instances where tribes have taken over some public land agencies or management responsibilities, but it's been pretty modest. And so my argument in this paper that I've not published yet really formally, but I put a draft out there, is that we have mechanisms for tribes and federal public land management agencies to work together on these things. And so that's my idea, and it's just one way to do co-management. There's a lot of others too, and we should be pressing on all fronts to try to do that. But this is one relatively simple, well-beaten path where it would be easy to do, and it's a modest idea, but I think an important one it could be. So that's what my paper is about, and my idea is about, that I'm trying to get out there and get people to talk about.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks for sharing that, Kevin. And just when I was looking through the examples, it seemed like there were some themes that tribes must be extremely patient and endure lots of pushback from public opposition groups, and it was like the story of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe was really interesting, because they endured. I mean, they were able to get the co-management agreement, but it was kind of a PR challenge for them for a period of time. They lost it, and then it was restored, and finally, but it was finally resolved by legislation. And that was an interesting story, because it's like, well, they tried to use those tools. I mean, I guess the tools were a lever that they were able to get a foothold, and then but eventually it took Congress to intervene. I mean, what do you think in terms of those lessons for tribes that want to take on co-management? I mean, I have Bears Ears right here in the background, and that's had a similar, back and forth. Yeah, but no engagement by Congress yet.
That's right. We do, these landscapes are sites of battles, right? And tribes have never gotten much without patience and often a fight. And so that's what Nick's bringing, the fight. And so that's exactly right. Yeah, the National Bison Range is located entirely within the boundaries of the Flathead Indian Reservation. And the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes said, we would like to manage the Bison Range. And they ultimately ended up signing an agreement allowing them to do so. The Bison Range is run by the Fish and Wildlife Service, or it was, and Fish and Wildlife Service agreed. Honestly, bison are something that is enormously important to tribes and not all that important to the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's not an endangered species. It's and not protected, and they mostly focus on threatened or endangered species. The bison don't meet that category under federal law. And it wasn't really a high priority for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so they said, sure, we'll let you, we'll contract with the tribe to manage that. Well, a lot of people couldn't handle the Flathead Reservation, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai running the Bison Range. So it produced litigation and people saying, well, you got to comply with the National Environmental Policy Act and do an EIS before you do that. And so litigation, it didn't go smoothly at all. It's a small operation. It's got a lot of bison, but it's only got about 10 employees or something like that. I mean, it's not a big deal, and it's entirely within the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes reservation. And by the way, they're a very capable tribe. I mean, tribes tend to be very capable. They're one of the most capable, honestly. They run a lot of stuff very, very well. And but they got so much opposition, Congress ultimately had to intervene, and the opposition won the battle because they got the contracts defeated, but they lost the war because Congress said, look, if you guys can't get along, we're just going to return this to the tribe, because we're confident in their ability to run the National Bison Range. So kind of a happy ending. And this contracting regime was part of the story. And indeed, it did get the tribe more involved. That's not maybe the best example because the contract ultimately failed, but it's an example that, we don't need the federal government running all of these public lands in Indian country or near Indian country. They've got really good potential partners out there in tribes.
Yeah, and I would, to hop in there. I mean, I think for everybody watching this out there, I mean, when we talk about the LandBack movement and when we talk about the desire to dismantle systematic racism and systems of white supremacy. A lot of times people think that we're calling all white people white supremacist when we're actually talking about a system of white supremacy that is benefiting one group over another. And the reality is most of the systems that have been put in place in this country and most of the mechanisms, from the way that Bureau of Land Management does their leases down to how how often DOI has mismanaged their trust responsibility to Native people. See, the original intentions of many of these institutions were to conquer Native people and to colonize them. And so in the LandBack movement, when we talk about, hey, we need to reclaim our land and reclaim our power, and we need to dismantle the systems of power and oppression that make it possible for the continued erasure of our people and the systems that make it possible to keep our land from us. And the reality is BLM, Forest Service, DOI, many of these things have been successful at keeping Native people away from their land and off their land for quite some time. And I think that some of the mechanisms that have been worked on in the past have made some pathways to it, but don't get it twisted. Every time Native people in this country are going to be entering into co-management or reclaiming lands, it will disrupt the status quo in those regions in which it happened, and it will disrupt the power structures in those regions. And so we have to recognize that the Salish and Kootenai tribes is a good example of the fact of the resistance that will come, even though there's political mechanisms and good intention created for these pathways to happen for our people. And this is why we have to really think about standing in our power and in different mechanisms in different ways. And we have to think about the reclaiming of our lands and our power in multiple different forms. Because, you look at PILT, payment in lieu of taxes. A lot of times people don't know that jurisdictions that have national parks and big public lands in those regions, they get payments in lieu of taxes because those federal lands are being non-taxed, but within their jurisdiction. And so all of a sudden, something as simple as Indian people saying, oh, hey, we want to get our land back and get access to our sacred places and try to protect these places. All of a sudden you have towns and local governments saying, whoa, don't be messing with my PILT. That's 25% of my county government budget or whatever. And so all of a sudden you start seeing how baked in, in society, in government structures, how baked racism really is. And so you're uncovering these things. And so I think that's where a lot of times you're like, well, we have the right to, we can 638 contract, we can enter into co-management, we can do these different things. Yet those things are disrupting power structures that exist today, So I think that we have to be prepared. And that's why some of this is a narrative battle. That's why the LandBack movement needs to be the mechanism for social justice for Indian people in this country. And if you're attacking land, the indigenous people getting their land back, well, you're attacking the very sovereignty of the people who've been impacted by society today. You're impacting the people who are experiencing the most amount of poverty in this country, who are experiencing the most amount of these things. And so that's why these big strategies also are narrative battles at the end of the day. We cannot keep Indian people off their land in the same way that we can't keep killing Black people in the streets in this country either. Both of those things are wrong, fundamentally, morally, ethically. And so that's where this, these worlds sort of come together and collide. And I know that, one of the reasons in which we engaged in this, like in the region I'm from, I grew up as a little boy, growing up, going to treaty council meetings about the return of the Black Hills. My parents were activists. My parents met at Wounded Knee, and I grew up in this movement. And all of the tribes in South Dakota have been removed from the Black Hills. And so you have all these tribes throughout this region, and yet we travel there for our sacred sites, but we control almost none of the land. Very, very, very small pieces of land in the sacred Haisapa. And it is one of the longest legal battles in the country over land. And so, one of the reasons we wanted to really amplify the LandBack movement and put it in the context of right now at this political moment in history was because we were watching what was happening in the uprising after the death of George Floyd. And we wanted to do something that could stand in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters, while at the same time connecting the land movement and the land rights issues in this country to the issues of time in today, and putting it in the context of now. And so when we engaged to launch the LandBack campaign, and we engaged in the amplification of the Black Hills issue into the national scene again, it was to put Native people, in equal footing in the present, saying that we are fighting for the liberation of our people and our lands. And it is side by side with the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, and that our collective liberation is bound up with one another. And these things are important because all of a sudden people started hearing the Indigenous people's struggle for land back and the return of our land in a different context. They started seeing it, saying, "Oh, this is also a part of this is like a bigger social justice issue." And so these narratives are important because a lot of times, in some of these conversations, the average mainstream person in society, they're like, 638, self-determination. I don't even know what all that means. Indian people know, because we have to live those realities. But mainstream society, is disconnected from those things. And that's the cool thing about LandBack, is you're starting to see it. It's starting to become a cultural movement and a cultural narrative, which also makes many of us that are either on the front lines or trying to move things like co-management, return of lands, it makes it more accessible. And it makes it more part of the everyday conversation.
Yeah, and this seems like an interesting opportunity with the new administration, the new Secretary of Interior. President Biden, in his plan for tribal nations, promised to provide tribes with a greater role in the care and management of public lands that are of cultural significance to tribal nations. So, that's a pretty strong statement, especially compared to other administrations. So, and then we have the boarding school inquiry that's underway. And we just haven't seen this level of commitment to identifying our country's true history. And the boarding schools is part of it. It's an important foundational part of it, but it's much bigger. And I'm hopeful that there's an establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but what do you guys see in terms of opportunities at this moment in time with this administration? It seems like this is the administration, if you want the Black Hills back, and there's a legal and moral imperative for that, this is the time to get that.
Well, let me say that this administration, there's a lot of potential here. And part of the reason for my paper is that, I've always been sort of pragmatic and sort of incremental. And I admire Nick's fight, but my thing is, trying to figure out what's the one step that we can do to make things better. And then another step after that, hopefully. But we now have Deb Haaland as Secretary of the Interior. And that means she oversees the Bureau of Land Management, and the Bureau of Land Management oversees 250 million acres in the United States. And the Fish and Wildlife Service has 90 million acres, and Deb Holland oversees the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Park Service has 80 million acres that they manage. And so that's those three agencies alone. Imagine, you know, they manage a vast part of the United States. And my view is that, you know, all those federal employees that are doing that work, those regional directors, those park superintendents, they are all now, their boss is a woman who rocks her mocks, right? And my hope is that they will, you know, be more interested in this, you know, doing 638 contracts with tribes, because, you know, their boss is interested in that. So I think there is real opportunity right now. And by the way, the one that I left out was the Forest Service. The Forest Service has 190 million acres that they manage. And the number 3 person in the Forest Service is Janie Hipp. She's the general counsel there. And so we've got, you know, Native people in very high level positions in government right now to pursue some of these things. Restoring the Black Hills to the tribes is a big lift. That, you know, that's huge. That, you know, that's a very ambitious type goal. But there's a lot of simpler, you know, easy things that can be done too, towards that, you know, moving in that direction. And so I hope that we're pursuing the entire spectrum of relief. And I think that we ought to be pressing on all fronts.
I got something kind of exciting to share that's happening up here, and then I know that we were getting to these questions, but just off of what Kevin just shared, you know, there was a political climate, right, in the Obama administration where there was a door of opportunity opened to talk about the return of the Black Hills and like, what does that mean? And you know, the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota tribes within the Oceti-Sakowin, we couldn't get organized in a way to take that conversation further. And so therefore that conversation eventually, you know, it went flat. And we learned our lesson. You know, we learned our lesson from that. And I'm excited about what we're actually building right now. And so we're proposing something that's pretty excited, and it's called the Oceti-Sakowin Nation Land Trust. And the Oceti-Sakowin Nation Land Trust, and I'd be curious to what you have to say about this, Kevin, too, but the Oceti-Sakowin Nation Land Trust is being set up as an intertribal Section 17 corporation for the sole purpose of managing public lands and co-managing public lands within the Oceti-Sakowin Treaty area, starting with public lands in the Black Hills. And so we are preparing an application, you know, to go to DOI for the creation of this entity. Lots of tribes, we got excited about it right now. There's 11 initial tribes that are excited about it. We're going to expand it to include probably 16 tribes from this region. But the reason to set it up as a Section 17 corporation, equally owned by all of these tribes, is because there's so many tribes that have connection to the Black Hills and the Hisapa. And so to create a shared decision-making structure and a legal structure that can enter into the co-management agreements, a structure that can have staff, a structure that can receive grants, can receive contributions, you know, can run, you know, Department of Labor workforce programs to get people back on the land and reestablishing that connection between the land and the people that has been lost over time. And Indian Collective has been honored to be supporting the sovereignty and the self-determination of these tribes in this region. And of course, the other obvious reason to set up a Section 17 corporation to do this in this way is that it builds capacity over time. You know, if you look at the Menominee, if you look at the Salish and Kootenai, and if you look at the good land managers throughout the country, they're very much invested into having biologists and researchers and land managers, and really being able to modernize our ability to manage our own lands, and also manage them better than they've been managed underneath the federal government. And so we're super excited about this. Myself, I visited 6 different tribes in the last 7 days, mustering up support and doing all this, groundwork, and as a community organizer. And people are fired up here in the Osheti Shakoi about this, because now a lot of times tribal leaders have been saying to people in power, like return of the Black Hills, return of the land. And then the Fed has been like, well, what's your plan then? And they're like, okay, now we got a plan. So that's something that's brewing up, and it's coming from the region up here. Again, it's not the only way and mechanism to enter into co-management agreements, but it's one mechanism. It also, in this structure, it doesn't bar tribes from having their own negotiations with the federal government on pieces of land too. It's just an addition to. And of course, the last thing of being, set up as a Section 17 corporation, it only strengthens the sovereignty of the federally recognized tribes in this region. It carries, that sovereign status into a corporate structure that, that makes sense to DOI too. And so, and of course, having folks like Deb Howland in office, and Janie Hip, and Weezy Pun Little Elk, and Brian Newland, and all these people within the government who really care about these issues, and have went to go serve because of them. It's going to only help us, but on the ground, we have to meet them halfway, right? We have to be able to help deliver wins for those in power for us. And so, I just wanted to share that as like one of the huge pressing LandBack, things that is happening, where we're really able to connect grassroots community organizing with the strengthening of tribal sovereignty for the purpose of co-management.
Nick, that's all so exciting. One of the things, as everybody in Indian country knows, we can be our own worst enemies, just fighting amongst ourselves sometimes. And honestly, I won't say enemy, but there's a common opponent out there that if we can work together, we can do much better. And honestly, I think that what you just said about giving wins to the federal government needs wins too. That Deb Haaland needs wins, Joe Biden needs wins, and if we can find ways to partner with them so that they can succeed and tribes can succeed, that can be really powerful. And one of the things is it's just about competence. Tribes manage these lands for eons, right? Many generations. They've got traditional ecological knowledge. They've got skills and wisdom that they can bring to this work, the work that the federal government is trying to do. And I don't want to criticize federal employees so much, but honestly, tribes have this vast experience and this passion for these lands that probably exceeds a lot of the federal employees' passions. And so they can bring that focus to bear. And I think that that's really, really important, that it's about tribal competence, as tribes are institutionally more competent than federal agencies in some ways to manage these lands. One of the things that was most exciting to me during the Obama administration was the acquisition of Paisley, which was a joint tribal acquisition. Some tribes in South Dakota came together and Minnesota came together and said, we're going to acquire this, and ask the federal government to take it into trust. And it was really neat, kind of unusual for tribes to jointly own trust land and to approach the federal government together on something. And that was really a good sign. And I see more and more of that happening. And I think that that's really important. And it requires activists, community organizers to organize our communities and get things like that done. And so it's really exciting. There's great, I think, potential and I've got great optimism about all of this. And we're going to see some small things happen. I think we're going to see some bigger things happen too, if we can keep up that kind of organization and that kind of momentum. So Nick, thanks for your work.
Absolutely. No, we're fired up about it. I think that, and maybe this, Ethel, maybe this is one of the directions you're heading in with this, next part of this conversation too, but climate change is affecting everybody throughout humanity, and tribes currently today manage 56 million and some change acres, and it's some of the better some of the better managed land right now. And so it's kind of this interesting conversation with the feds too, of like the current lands that are being managed by Native people are actually being managed much better. If you look at like the untilled natural, deep-rooted, grasslands that exist throughout the entire United States, is only about 1.2% of that actually left. But something like 75% of it is actually on Native people's lands. And so like that's an indicator. If you think about it, and you zoom out globally, it's kind of the same thing globally. 80% of the world's biodiversity that is needed to combat climate change is in the either control, management, or within of indigenous people globally. And it just tells you that there's a set of values, right? It's not just quote unquote management or stewardship. It's more, it's taking, the relationship between, the people and the land and like embedding that together and recognizing we wouldn't do things of our land that directly impacts the health of our tribal members and our people and our community. And so I think that, a lot of times when people hear LandBack, and I run into this all the time, and I'm always trying to look for feedback around it. When you say LandBack, white people kind of grab their purse. Like, oh, I'm gonna grab my purse and lock my door. Look out the blinds. The folks think they were coming for their I don't know, their known little statues in their front yard or whatever, and I think the reality is, I think that we have to address the fragility of white folks in America in this part of this conversation, because I think that part of what we're saying is that land back and public lands being returned back to indigenous people via co-management or other means is actually good for all of humanity. It's actually a good thing for those of you that are scared of the concept and idea, particularly because globally we're trying to fight climate change and it's affecting all of us in the world. And so, I'm not sure what either one of your thoughts are on that, but I know that's something I'm constantly sort of like, in this work, maneuvering all the time and saying, hey, actually, this could be a better thing for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Nick, I love the way you put that, because it's actually, land back. I think some people think, you mean all of it? Right? And it's like, well, I like the way you present the land back idea that, well, land back because, or land, we should do this because land back. It's not that all of North America has to be returned tomorrow to tribes necessarily, but there are lots of things short of that we can do, and that are less threatening to people. A lot of great things. There's a whole list. Every year, the federal government publishes in the Federal Register a list of all the park units and all the Fish and Wildlife Service refuges and such, where tribes could sign contracts and take over some functions. And we've done it. There's a list of dozens and dozens and dozens on this sheet that gets published every year in the Federal Register, and we've only got 5 or 6 of those. I mean, why don't we have a dozen? Why don't we have 2 dozen? Why don't we have 3 dozen of those contracts in place? And some of them are really straightforward. The Grand Portage National Monument is located adjacent to the Grand Portage Band of Ojibwe in northern Minnesota, at the tip of Canada. I mean, at the way out on north side of Lake Superior. And really, the band is really the only other community out there, honestly. And so it just makes sense for them to have a significant role in running the Grand Portage National Monument. In fact, they donated some of the land for that monument. And so they really ought to be, and they're doing some work there, but they probably ought to be running the whole monument, not just having little, small contracts for parts of it. They ought to be running the whole thing. And there's examples like that all over the United States. And so there's some real opportunities here. And Bears Ears, we've got, several tribes that are willing to work together to help manage Bears Ears. And that's been a battle. That's, there's some partisan battling around some of these iconic sites like Bears Ears. So there's certainly opposition to these sorts of things, but there are tribes with indigenous knowledge and experience that are really interested in doing this work, and that it's a target-rich environment. There's a lot of good opportunities for it, and we just need to start doing it. So, and there's, I think we will. I think with this leadership at Interior and in the federal government generally. I think we're going to start seeing some more of this, but we got to keep pushing. We never had anything given to us. We've only, gotten things when we've been very persistent and keep talking and keep pushing. So I'm glad to see that happening.
You bring up Bears Years, and it reminds me of, how that was really a battle of narratives, right? I mean, there was sort of one side that was like, hey, this is our backyard, basically, and we've used this, we've been on these lands, using these lands productively, or for recreation purposes for generations. And then on the other side, it was like, hey, this is a cultural landscape that provides answers to an unknown history that we want to preserve and capture and learn, and we want to use this space and the medicines here to facilitate cultural transmission. So that, is that real struggle over what Bears Years is and should be. But that reminds me of one of the more exciting examples you highlighted, Kevin, which is the Sitka National Historic Park, where the Sitka tribe of Alaska, they have a very small contract,
Yeah,
but it's a powerful contract because they are staffing that park, and they are telling the narrative of what that place is. And that's, so important, especially as we get people comfortable with LandBack. There's been so much erasure of the history of North America. And so people aren't mentally prepared. Like, they have a very narrow grasp of what that history is. And to get them in that space where they're like, okay, LandBack is a good thing, and it means all of these other things, a much more complex thing than what first comes to mind. And that narrative and education piece is so important.
No, it's true. And that Sitka example is interesting. And then frankly, lately it's run on they've had a rocky relationship, I think. And so I'm not sure the status currently. I've sort of done some updating, and I'm not sure that the relationship is still going on. But there's this national park up in a National Historic Park up in Alaska, and it's largely created to commemorate sort of a battle between the local indigenous people and the Russians that were kind of trying to take over Alaska, that part of Alaska. And that's what it's there for. And so the tribe just sort of said, can we help with interpretive services? Can we come in and tell the story? And they did get a modest contract to do that, which is good, right? Frankly, Mike Black, who was then the director of the BIA, was riding his motorcycle across country one time, and he stopped into a national park somewhere in the Western United States. I don't know if it was Montana or South Dakota or where, but he said that he walked in and they had white people dressed up as Native Americans, doing interpretive services, like trying to educate people about the meaning of the park. And he went to the park superintendent and said, this is not right. Red face is not allowed anymore. You got to stop this. But natives are the obvious place to go for a lot of the interpretive services at all of our federal park units, because they're the ones that can tell the deepest, most meaningful story about these landscapes. And so that one seems to me like low-hanging fruit. Sure, maybe you're not comfortable with the Navajo Nation taking over the Grand Canyon, but surely you could agree that maybe Navajo people should come in and do interpretive services at the Grand Canyon, right? That doesn't seem too outrageous. That seems quite sensible. And so that does seem to be low-hanging fruit to me for these 638 contracts. Some situations like that make a lot of sense, and they're not very ambitious, but they're better than what we have now. So and ultimately, I'd like to see tribes actually running many of these park units and many of these wildlife refuges and that sort of thing. And I think we could get there eventually.
Yeah, I want to say something too, because I think something that gets lost, I feel like, in the LandBack movement too, is like, once we get into doing these conversations about co-management, like, we don't want the spirit to get lost in which this is coming for. We aren't doing this to be of some service to the federal government. These are our lands. This isn't about us doing something that's palatable to people who live along the Grand Canyon or who live in the Black Hills. There was an extreme injustice that happened here. This is not your land, right? And so I think that like there is a swagger in the land back movement where we're saying like F you to that stuff. F you to you, it's palatable to you. Like this is our land. This is about reclaiming of our power as a people. And we want to make sure that like as we enter into co-management agreements and we do these different strategies, that like the spirit of the people doesn't get watered down in the process, and the true intention behind it. And there's some big things that need to change. For us to manage the Black Hills, how we want to manage the Black Hills as the Lakota, the 1872 Mining Act is a problem. The 1872 Mining Act allows, yeah? Hold on one quick second.
The 1872 Mining Act is not just a problem for Lakota, it's like a problem for a lot of tribes actually, because it really just allows a lot of abuses it needs to be reconsidered. And I think a lot of people would say that it does need to be reconsidered and amended and maybe repealed because of what it allows. So Nick is not wrong about the problems with the 1872 Mining Act. It's kind of outrageous. If it were enacted today, if someone proposed it today, you would say it was outrageous if it wasn't already on the books. But there it is.
Yeah, totally. Because I think about that, right? Because like we want to manage these lands in a good way, in line with our values, in line with the goals of protecting it and all those things. Then you see like, so if we're managing the lands, do these mining companies just get to come in here on public lands and just have their way with these leases? Or do we get to intervene, and those things could lead to lawsuits. It could, so I think that there has to be political strategies to potentially repeal that act, because I think that you look at some of the priorities that have been set out from the Tribal Nation Summit, just last week, and DOI and the Biden administration, some of the goals that they have set out are in direct, conflict with things like the 1872 Mining Act, or the things like opening up leases for oil and gas on public lands. So there's a lot of things that have to be transformed, because things like the 1872 Mining Act were created, and that's one of the massive drivers for why public lands has been managed the way it's been managed in the past, and quite frankly, why it's been mismanaged, in the process too. And I think that when we think about co-management, we should also think about it as strategies, sort of battle plans for tribes of how they protect places, because it's one thing to be a tribe that is going to be consulted whenever there's an oil and gas project to your region. But what happens when you're actually in co-management and all of a sudden, these extractive projects that many of your tribes are against end up, going through a territory that you're co-managing? That's a different positionality than being on the outside looking in. And I think that tribes should be thinking about that as also strategies to engage in deeper ways. And maybe, just maybe, that co-management may be a mechanism to get us closer to this idea of free and prior informed consent, instead of instead of a policy area of consultation. Maybe it's one strategy and mechanism to get us closer to that too.
No question about that, Nick. Certainly tribes would have a much stronger voice as to the facility they're managing, or the unit they're managing, for sure. And so that's a really good point. It's it's a mechanism for tribal self-governance and tribal self-determination, for sure. And I think that's exactly right. It's a good point.
Yeah, but I feel like this kind of gets us back to that issue, though, sort of like the underpinnings of the system, right? Because like Standing Rock, there was a tribe that should have had really strong say in what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And, Line 3, there's a tribe that the pipeline runs right through the reservation. But because there are these pre-existing agreements, it makes it difficult for them to have the level of say that you would expect them to have as the nations on whose lands that infrastructure runs through.
It's one. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the power dynamic is different. If the Lakotas were in co-management of the Missouri River watershed here today, our positionality would be shut off the pipeline. The reason why is because the Dakota Access Pipeline is currently operating without a permit. Right now, today, the Dakota Access Pipeline, according to a federal judge, does not have a permit to be operating, but a federal judge has not ordered them to shut off the pipeline. So then therefore the oil is going through the pipeline. Well, if we were the managers of it, we're like, well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, most suburban neighborhoods in America, you can't even put up a picket fence without a permit, you can't even plant a tree that's bigger than, 4 inches around without a permit in most neighborhoods. Yet we can have an entire pipeline underneath a watershed that's providing water access, to millions and millions of Americans. That's where I think that, in co-management, we could intervene and say, okay, well, let's shut off the pipeline, prioritize people's health and people's safety, and then until this issue is dealt with, And so I think that there's examples like that where we really do need to flex tribal sovereignty for the betterment of not only tribes, but the environment and everybody who needs safe drinking water in the world,
I think what Nick is doing is sort of, let us imagine a world where tribes are, keenly involved in all kinds of decisions with regard to federal land across the country. Think about the different decisions that would be made if that were the case. And I think we would see a different approach to things. And I do think we would also see some sort of much more natural and organic approaches to dealing with climate change and conservation. And because the tribes would be at the table making some of the decisions about those things, at least making them in partnership with the federal government and bringing a really important voice and important wisdom to that conversation. So I can see, I think it would be good for all of us over the long term. It'd be good for the whole world, Indians and non-Indians alike, to have tribes with a greater voice in all of those places. So it's we got a long way to go and a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we've been talking about a few different ways of approaching that. And I love what Nick was able to share about the land trust and the Section 17 corporation, because there's a spectrum of entities that this work can be done through, whether it's, a nonprofit, a land trust, an intertribal coalition, something created by Congress. What comes to mind is the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission that has managed the Columbia River very, very well. And then there are also different interfaces, right? Like right now we're talking about utilizing tools of the federal government, but there's also municipal governments and state governments and those types of intergovernmental agreements. And that's what I love about Nick's approach here with the trust is it's being creative. It's thinking like, well, what do we want as Indigenous peoples? And then it's figuring out, well, how do we get there? Like, what's the right tool and who's the right interface for us to accomplish that objective? And one thing that comes to mind is what the Yoshadihi Winton Tribe of California has done with a local municipality in protecting one of their sacred sites in a municipal park, entering into an agreement with them directly. So it's, really objective driven, and the nation has been adaptive in how they approach that in order to fulfill their objective.
That's true, Ethel. There's so many, my focus is the federal government because it's what I know, but wow, think about city governments, municipal governments, county governments, state governments, and frankly, I think they're all feeling the heat these days too, that they need to work better with tribal governments. And I think that's a good thing, that they should feel some pressure to to do the right thing. And there's a federal trust responsibility. And so that's the kind of the hook that we have with the federal government. But I think LandBack, the whole concept reminds us all that every government in America has some responsibilities here, because they're all living on tribal lands ultimately. So they need to be stepping up to the plate as well.
Yeah, I know we're getting close to time, but I have a prediction. I have a prediction to share with the audience and to both of you. I think, and I've been in philanthropy a long time. I've been organizing philanthropy. We do grant making to over 500 tribes and organizations throughout Indian country here at the collective. And I think that the wave of the future is going to be Indigenous-led conservation. And I think that the Indigenous-led conservation is going to be a catalyzer of change for this country, both to combat climate change, both to return lands back to Indigenous people, to protect the natural environment, to re-strengthen sovereignty. And I think that's a lot of the work that, that we're doing here at the collective is challenging some of those institutions of philanthropy too, and addressing white supremacy and generational racism in those institutions. And we have started to see foundations and philanthropic organizations begin to change to sing a different tone. And I think that LandBack provides an opportunity for them to engage in Indigenous-led conservation that could be transformative to the world. So I think that we're going to enter into the decade of Indigenous-led conservation that could lead to potentially millions of acres being protected in and around Indigenous people by Indigenous people in partnership with the federal government and the conservation groups and funders of the world, but having it done on Indigenous terms and Indigenous values. So that's my prediction, and some of the place I'm going to be putting my sweat equity into.
That's great. Well, I know we're approaching time, but I would love, and that's a great parting thought, Nick. Kevin, do you have any parting thoughts?
I've got nothing more beautiful than what Nick just said, so I'm going to let that be the last word on Indigenous-led conservation. That's beautiful, beautiful.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you both so much for joining and for this robust conversation, and I mean, just for inspiring us with hope for the future, and with a real tangible example, Nick, with the land trust that you guys are working on, possibly laying the pathway for other Indigenous nations to play out that future that you predict. So thank you both.
Absolutely, it was an honor. Good to see you. Good to see you both, and look forward to future conversations. All right, take care.
Absolutely, you too. Bye.